Welcome to the How to Write Research Papers podcast, where you'll get fresh insights and listen in on expert perspectives about writing research papers. I'm your host, Dr. Nacke, a professor and university research chair at the University of Waterloo, and I'm passionate about writing with AI and giving you tips on how to improve your own writing. In each episode, we unpack AI writing techniques, interview experts, and show you the tricks that will make you a more productive writer and efficient researcher. Whether you're looking to understand scientific writing, research productivity, or the latest AI prompting techniques, you'll find valuable insights and actionable strategies in every episode. Before we dive in, if you're enjoying the show, make sure to hit subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you'll never miss an episode. Now, let's get started. Today, I'm interviewing Phoebe Toobs-Dugas, the CHI 2024 and 2025 Papers Chair. And I'm excited about this interview because we've been friends for a long time.
I'm Phoebe Toobs-Dugas, 2024 and 2025 Papers Chair for the ACM SIG CHI Conference on Human Factors and Computing Systems. And I'm an associate professor at Monash University in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia.
Welcome to the podcast, Phoebe. I'm super excited that we're restarting this. It's been dormant for a couple of years now. The How to Write CHI Papers podcast. As you might not know, it's actually moving into a How to Write Research Papers podcast with a sort of special startup edition of CHI Papers. So we're kind of taking the old and molding it into the new. So if at any point in time your advice is a little bit more general, it's no problem. And obviously a lot of our listeners are coming from all different sorts of the writing spectrum. But I did want to invite you today because I'm very excited to learn about your journey. Now, we've been friends for a long time and gone through this world of publishing together, even on separate several papers. The first thing I want to ask you is really, what do you feel has had the significant changes on publishing, just the way you've experienced it?
Probably the biggest thing is paper length. Back when we started, you had 4-page papers and 10-page papers, right? Papers and notes, and references were counted, right? And as a grad student, we all did the thing of like, if you abbreviate the reference names and you can squeeze more in, right? And there was this constant sort of like need to compress your writing, to think carefully about how you used words, to make choices about what appeared in papers. We saw things shift to where we didn't count references anymore. And so then you really just had 10 pages of text and images, to kind of our current state where we don't really do page limits so much anymore.
And why don't we do page limits anymore? Like, what happened?
Ultimately, what that means is it's very possible to submit papers that are kind of a lower level of polish. And so there's sort of this trade-off, right? Like you probably have some papers that are like a lower level of polish. People have spent less time just making them really good and tight and quicker to read. And then, of course, there's plenty of work where it just legitimately needs more space. I do a lot of qualitative work. I do a lot of things where we have, we've been on these papers, right? We have these giant figures and you want to like get the quotes in there and everything. And so sometimes some work does need to be longer, like for sure. I think that was sort of what we wanted to accommodate, right? You want to just like let people be creative and make the work that they want to make or that needs to be made, but it also kind of opens the door to papers being longer than they need to be.
The question that I do get a lot on my social media profiles from younger writers is specifically that sectioning of a paper. How is the percentage of introduction to related work, to methods, to discussion? Do you feel any of that has changed? What proportion has gained the most? My hunch would be maybe discussions, but I'm going to let you do your take on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's like, but discussion is kind of what you want to get longer. I mean, I also run into plenty of papers where the people didn't like write a discussion. It's just like, so what? Like, it's hard to know. A lot of it comes in probably the data sections. Backgrounds probably haven't changed a whole lot, although I guess the other big frustration is sort of backgrounds that are not really, don't really synthesize the work. They just sort of tell you about a bunch of things that have been written. It's not coming in conclusion. It might come in discussion. And if it comes in discussion, that's probably what we want, right? That's where the kind of exciting, fun connections to the rest of the world, the takeaways show up. But I really suspect it probably shows up more in kind of the data portion, the results, I guess.
So I did read an interesting alt Chi paper, this year's Chi, that's kind of criticizing the normalization, let's say, of the scientific paper, where, of course, this has been going on for 100-something years, that we have the IMRAD structure, we have introduction methods, results, and discussion. In our case, we also have the related work, of course, in Chi. Now, the question is, are we becoming more normalized as we're getting more tools to help us write these things? Or do you think because now we're less limited in terms of pages, do we have more room for creativity?
I have personally kind of taken it as an opportunity to be a little more creative with my paper layouts. Now, whether or not that works out, another question entirely. And unfortunately, as papers chair, you don't actually look at any of the papers except for like the ones that are problematic. So it's hard to have kind of that insight into what Chi looks like right now. I think more the experimental ones probably follow that structure. I think places where we do qualitative research, where we do observational stuff, where we're making arguments, I think those kinds of works follow it a little bit less.
Let's talk a little bit more about the role of a papers chair, because I think for our listeners, that's super important. Again, there's a lot of junior researchers out there that are just wondering, what is that like? A lot of people are asking, what's the role of an associate editor, which I think you've also done editing roles before the papers chairing role. You said you're not really looking at the papers that much anymore. What do you do as a papers chair?
Papers chairs really ends up being, at least at Chi, it's more of a management kind of role, right? I think at some of our smaller conferences like Chi Play, there's like maybe one less layer of federation that happens, right? So we have the technical program chairs who choose the papers chairs, and at least lately, at least one of the papers chairs has been rolling over, so that's why I'm doing it for 2025 to carry the knowledge forward. Underneath us were 48 subcommittee chairs. So there were at least 2 per subcommittee. Some subcommittees had 3, some subcommittees had 4, and then so we recruit all of those people. And again, kind of doing the thing where it's like, hopefully we have one at least that can roll over who has only done it for 1 year so they can carry forward the expertise, right? And then they help us select and recruit a partner or more partners. And then each one of those people, each subcommittee chair, each SC is in charge of selecting a number of ACs, associate chairs, right? And the associate chair is the one that's probably most analogous to like an associate editor, right? So they're the ones who are going to say, right, we've gotten all of these papers into our subcommittee, right? And subcommittees, I guess, just for that piece of context for Chi as well, are sort of, I guess they're concept driven, right? So there's games in play, there's understanding people, and there's 3 different versions of understanding people: statistical, qualitative, and mixed methods. And so subcommittee chairs are in charge of each one of those. They're going to recruit a pool of ACs, associate chairs. ACs can serve on only one subcommittee. And then the ACs will choose the reviewers for each individual paper in their subcommittee.
Our listeners know there is a whole course that I'm teaching where I'm going over this entire structure. So if you want to dive a little bit deeper, by any means, check out the comments. If you're watching this on YouTube, if you're on the podcast, go to the website, chicourse.com, and you'll find all the information there about all of the details. We don't really need to go over that here, but you know where to find it. And so one of the things that I am actually interested in here is then, you said some papers we still have to double check, right? Like there's always this question about desk reject. So tell me, what is the hallmark of a desk reject? Because junior researchers are always asking that too. Like, what are the biggest mistakes that I can make that you won't even consider my work?
Desk rejects and quick rejects they came about a couple of years ago. This past year, we made the choice to only do desk rejects. And the difference is kind of where in the process it happens, right? So desk rejects are very upfront. Quick rejects were meant for the paper got a little bit further into the process, and then we kind of realized that it's really not going to, like, there's no way it's going to get through. So let's, fail fast, essentially. So we got rid of that because it felt like a frustration. It felt like sort of an extra set of hurdles that people were having to deal with, and then try to basically expand what goes under desk reject. So what goes under desk reject? Most of these things are, I call it more mechanical sort of things. A big anonymization or failure to anonymize your work, and a little bit of question of sort of at what point is that not okay? And we have very sort of hopefully clear guidelines about making sure that, like none of your grant numbers appear. We don't know what institution you're at. right? We don't know who's involved. It doesn't appear in the metadata because we don't want that to bias things one way or another, right? We don't want reviewers who are like, oh, I really like Lenny's work. Well, I'm glad to see him. Let's just get it in, right? Things where it's just like grossly out of line with conference formatting. Like we're pretty lenient about things, but it's like all bold capital font on 3 pages or something. It's like, clearly that's not what this is. It's really things that like don't follow the structure of a research paper, but sort of broadly construed, right? Like if you submitted something that had like an introduction and a conclusion, we'd probably still take a look at it and make sure it's not like, oh, it's some really like novel, cool cleverness, but most likely it's not. The one that was controversial, the one that is changing for 2025, is basically kind of around situatedness in the Chi literature, in the Chi space. We did have ones this year that they cited 5 web pages and 2 encyclopedias and this book. And none of them are related to Chi. But it is like an actual paper that appears to be an actual paper. That's an extreme example, and it's not one I actually pulled from memory. But you can imagine that a paper that looks like that, it's not likely to actually say anything that the Chi audience is interested in, right? It doesn't have any situatedness in what's already come first. But there's no way to kind of desk reject those kinds of papers. So this year there is sort of a bullet point now for, is the work like situated in scholarly literature and or the Chi literature kind of as would make sense, which I think is something that subcommittee chairs can fairly easily judge.
Let's talk a little bit more about that interaction between, because it's a large conference, it's almost like, you could almost call it the conglomerate of journals, right? Because we have these other smaller conferences that are now all sort of part of a special issue of the proceedings of the ACM journal or PACM, where they lead into a journal publication. Now, Chi has not done that. Maybe you know some background about that too, why the conference remains with proceedings, even though in theory, and again, some of our viewers don't understand that about the field of computer science. Why do we have this weird mix between a high quality conference that is almost more impact than a journal, but now we're moving some of the other conferences into a journal? Why not move the flagship into a journal?
Yeah.
Thoughts on that?
It's a wild ride, I can tell you that, right? And so, of course, like you and I are kind of like young scholars in this field in a certain way. Of course, a lot of scientific disciplines use journals as their sort of primary method of doing scholarship.
Exactly.
My sense was always that computer science, as kind of like a newer field, sort of had this, like things were moving fast and conferences were the way to get your work out, right? And so I think we developed a number of sort of situations where our annual conferences, that was the place that you presented your work, and that was the place that you published your work, right? And so we developed these really high quality review processes to ensure that, it was quality work going into them. And consequently, computer science and really HCI, really in particular, has done most of its work in conferences. And then, of course, there were some journals along the way. My sense, if I remember correctly, it was CSCW that kind of first switched to this journal model, where you would basically have like a journal that's associated to the conference. You would publish your work through the journal process. At a certain point in the journal process, they would basically say, hey, all of the papers that have come in this time frame, do you want to present your work at the conference, right? And then they come and present their talks.
Well, the interesting thing that I think comes into play here is the rankings, right? Because there's Simago,
yeah,
whatever you want to call it, and you're now in an Australian university. So Australia, I think, has a very strict ranking system in terms of like where you should be publishing in terms of the quartiles of the journals.
Exactly.
And this is, of course, also interesting for our younger listeners or watchers here, that there is a difference when you're pursuing an academic career in terms of strategically seeking out journals in your field that fit within these quality indices. That's really the question here. Did Chi just not want to give up that quality thing that it's built over the years, that really places it on top, which if it merged with another existing journal publication, it would have lost that sort of prime time status, right? So maybe that is also partially a political thing?
I've been in some of the conversations in the steering committee, but I'm not on the steering committee. I went to the Future of SIG-Chi Summit a couple months ago, and people are having these conversations, right? So a bunch of the sort of spin-off conferences like Chi Play, I would honestly call CSCW kind of spin-off conference, but I think it has its own root. It functions that way at this point, if nothing else. Almost all of them have gone to kind of write this journal model and then present at the conference. And I think that was in response to it essentially is better for people's careers and more legible to the people making decisions about their careers if they're publishing in journals. Kai sort of keeps coming back to this question from what I understand. And there's some of it is like a bootstrapping thing, because since it's not a journal and it takes, I think it's at least 5 years before you can get ranked as a journal, because you essentially need 5 years of data on citations, then do you just sort of cut off Kai and you basically say well, so it's been this amazing place, but you have no way to rank it for the next 5 years. All of our 4,000 plus submissions this year, right? All of these people that want to get their work in, is it then worthwhile for them to submit it if they can't demonstrate to anyone who cares that it's a quality place? So in lieu of that, right, you end up using acceptance rate and descriptions of process as kind of the way to judge these things. And I will say, if you want the side note of Australia, there's core rankings, which are for conferences, and I've done on the core rankings panel as well. And you assess a bunch of different sources of data to kind of arrive at some conclusion about the quality of a conference and kind of its value for scientists to go to.
Care to enlighten us what those quality criteria are?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're pretty publicly listed, but a lot of it comes down to discussion. So you get data on how often work is cited from this conference, how often it happens, information on sort of its applicability globally, its applicability to its field, outside of its field. They collect a bunch of data on who attends the conference, how geographically spread they are, how frequently they attend. So there's a whole bunch of kind of things that sort of go into this kind of ranking of whether it's A, B, or C. And then there's also some sub things around it, whether it's regional or global, that kind of thing. And then there's A and A plus. And A would be something like A quality conferences are a certain level. A plus is basically then the flagship in the subfield.
I think a lot of really good details, organizational details here about the process, and I think that's really important for us to understand. But let's dial it back a little bit. After all, we are on the How to Write Papers podcast. So let's dig a little bit more into your writing techniques. Now, I always ask my guests on this show for some of the nuggets that they feel over the years have made their papers stand apart. So is there this one approach, this one structure in your head that you bring to paper writing that has made you successful in publications?
A lot of my work has become really qualitative. And I've been doing a lot of, since I've been reading a little bit more about thematic analysis, because we've been doing thematic analysis for a while. And there's sort of this big piece of it that's around sort of the way that the researcher approaches it, the way that the researcher brings themselves into the work actually is a key part of the work, right? And so
beyond the positionality statement?
Your positionality statement, your sort of understanding of what steps did you take, how have you involved yourself, what personal meaning kind of came out of things. And so writing positionality statements is something I've been doing a lot of, and a thing that I have been grumping at people for not writing sometimes, especially when they write really qualitative work. I'm not entirely convinced that everyone shouldn't just be writing positionality statements for all of your work. It's one thing to just say it's all statistics, but you make choices about what statistics you gather and how you collect them, and that could very, very easily be influenced by things like your past experience and your contextualization in the broader world. And
but that's more of a general thing that we all accepted as authors, that we need that in there. So what's the secret Phoebe sauce that we're adding to papers?
Like I said, I've been experimenting a lot with structure. Where does positionality statement go? Where do research questions go?
How do they go? What do you think? I have a very strong opinion about that.
Yeah, I've been putting them in the introduction lately. And I enraged one of my co-authors the other day because we have this really long introduction. I put subsections in it. He was like, "You put subsections in the introduction." I think it's probably my neurodivergent perspective. I really like having that structure. I discovered that I get really frustrated when I read papers where it's like they have sections but no subsections. And I'm just like, I'm now lost. I'm literally reading your paragraphs and I don't know what to expect or what I should have already gotten out of this. What is the like meaningful walk that I'm taking through this section right now?
This is actually interesting because there is some research that I can probably dig out for people that are interested that shows that over time we are actually using more subsections than we used 5 or 6 years ago.
I believe that.
So people are getting more chunkier
Yeah.
In terms of chunking up their writing. And I do think you're right. I do think it's a good thing, specifically now that we don't have the page limits anymore. So that's another thing that might be an artifact of not having to cram everything in that 8-10 page format. And now with that flexibility, why not give it a subsection? Why not help the reader parse the information a little bit better, right?
I guess I would say too, a lot of that ends up being organic. And maybe that's part of this, right? It's like you haven't, right? Neurodivergent writing for me is whatever, unlearning all of the ways I was taught to write stuff and figuring out what actually works for me and not just feeling terrible because I'm writing wrong. And I think one thing is that it's like I do kind of write an outline, but it often...
At the beginning?
Sometime near the beginning. And part of that process is then putting the actual structure into the template just because then it's kind of there and I can kind of go jump around and stick stuff in. But then there's a whole round of like revising this stuff as you go along, right? Of going, well, in my background, I was talking about X, Y, and Z, but X really has like 3 parts, but then the third part's kind of the merger between X and Y. Maybe that needs to be its own section or maybe its own subsection. I don't often end up with just like one background section. Sometimes I end up with multiple background sections just because the nested structure felt like it was enough that it's like I need like just a whole background on game design and background on historical ways of knowing and whatever. I have the real sense that this emerges from me like writing stuff and then kind of going back and going, it would make more sense to a reader if this was highlighted as its own section. Especially because maybe it has stuff on experience of transgender people. And they may need to reference back to it when they encounter an unexpected word later on in the text, right?
There's 2 more things that I want to talk about. So now that we kind of looked a little bit, okay, there's a way that we structure things differently. There's also now, of course, the big debate with the resurgence, or not resurgence, with the uprising of the robots, namely ChatGPT, Claude. What are your thoughts on that? Have you experienced in the review process? I know I've experienced it extensively in the review process.
Really?
And also, have you experienced it in the paper writing process as well?
In the review process, I haven't encountered any reviews that I've expressly been able to go, that's ChatGPT. We did have maybe a handful that were kind of brought to us, and we couldn't, wasn't any real way to sort of tease apart that that's really what happened. I think one thing I would say as a papers chair is that it's generally not okay to put other people's unpublished work into large language models because they shouldn't be learning from unpublished work. That's not, whatever, ethically okay. Writing a review and then running it through an LLM to whatever, make it into a functional piece of narrative, I guess is something someone could do. Again, it's a little bit almost putting someone else's unpublished work into an LLM in a certain way, but it's maybe less ethically questionable. At the same time, honestly, as a reader of other people's reviews, I would almost rather just get a point form list of concerns than a ChatGPT generated paragraph from point form concerns.
Of course, there's different ways of using it, right? Like people that outright just generate things and people that use it as a writing aid where the idea is essentially, okay, we're trying to make it better somehow.
Yeah, I mean, make your papers more concise. I have run into 1 or 2 written ones where it was like, these are a specific term, but then it's been sort of like transformed as if it were an English term. Specific ways that we as academic, like whatever, keywords that come out of years and years of research. And so when you sort of like twist them as if it's just like an adjective in English instead of a specific phrase. I don't know. I can make one, right? Like Csikszentmihalyi's flow theory, right? And if whatever your text said, like an inflowful theory or something like that.
Yeah.
Like that's maybe the kind of thing that like an LLM would go like, yes, I can just transform flow in this way, and like any human who knows anything would be like,
No.
wow, like you let that get through, did you? Please don't do that again.
I think that kind of brings us to this thought that we have to put into it, as in, now, I'm also teaching like a how to use AI productively as an academic kind of course or webinar. And I work with some people in that space where we're trying to get the good out of it. Now, we did have a keynote at this year's Chi that was kind of telling us that really it's a problematic space. There are environmental impacts attached to using AI. What did she say? Pretty much every time you put a query in, it's like pouring a bottle of water on the ground, right?
Absolutely.
Like just because of the cooling costs and the energy costs that are associated with this. So the question then is, now obviously academics have embraced this technology and they're using it everywhere because paper writing is our business, and these machines are great. That's a great way of being not just more productive, but like an easier way, I'd say, or a better technology. Just like when Word came along and made writing on a computer a little bit better.
Right.
But the question really is, as a person that's involved in the potential policies that might come along at the conference, do you see there being a backlash or a pushback more than there is now against any of these technologies? Or do you think people are eventually just going to embrace it as part of the toolkit?
I feel like it's kind of inevitable if they get embraced as part of the toolkit unless something really drastic or unexpected happens. You're responsible for anything that you write that has your name on it. And you're obligated not just to your current colleagues and your current field as someone producing knowledge, you're responsible to everyone who's going to come along after you. These are archival publications. That means that humans have spent time and attention on them and have asserted that there is long-term, for some definition of long-term, 10 to hundreds of thousands of years worth of value to the stuff that you wrote. You need to be able to stand by that. You need to be able to assert that it's true to the best of your ability, right? To the best of your knowledge, that it's valuable contributions to humanity. My sort of big worry with a lot of these things is less that it's sort of like cheapening our labor or it's making it quicker or easier. It's just not clear to me that these tools are sort of like founded on good sources.
Good intentions of
good intentions, right?
Companies running them.
What are the biases involved in the things that you extract from them? And certainly people being very mindful and careful, I could imagine, can very easily incorporate large language models into their writing and have that be a useful way to help you flesh out a section, and then you review it and you carefully make sure that it's not adding harmful things to the scholarly record, right? But there's a lot of bad scholarship that has been done over the centuries, and I worry from an ethical standpoint, right? I know when I write stuff that it's based on what I've known and experienced, and when I extract it from a generative AI system, I don't know what it's kind of drawing on to put stuff together for me.
I think a lot of people are kind of in this cyborg stage where there is, of course, their own intention, but there's also a lot of aid and a lot of support. And let's just hope that it actually makes the papers, the science better, and helps us overall a better understanding, get better research out there, so that everyone benefits, right?
How can we, usefully coexist with these tools and make them useful while understanding the potentials for harm and for whatever?
One last thing before we close this out. What is the one tip that you would give a junior writer that wants to be successful in publishing? It can be a strategic tip, it can be a writing tip, it can be a mindset tip. What kind of tip would you give?
I'm really into structure. Think carefully about how your paper is structured. When people read your work, it can help a lot for them to have guideposts. I personally find that I need it to know where I am and to know what should I know at this point? What are you still going to tell me, right? And those headers help me find those things. And so that's what I try to put in my own writing.
Thank you so much for taking the time, for coming on the podcast, and very excited for this to start again. Thanks, Phoebe.
Thank you. Lovely.